Chapter 12. The Tightening Trap. From Charles Manson's point of view, the genius of the plan to kill Hinman, that after he was killed, the house would be arranged to look like black radicals had done the murder. The Black Panthers would be suspected, and this would put heat on them. With the police coming down on them, the Black Panthers wouldn't have time to worry about Charles Manson. Once again, the consummate manipulator. And once again, Charles Manson's interests would be served. But the Hinman murder was slipshod. Manson wanted to distance himself from the crime, but this meant he had to tell others what to do. Others who, in the case of Mary and me, didn't want to be there, and who hadn't been told Manson's true motives, and so couldn't properly carry out his ideas. Manson had told so many lies to different members of the family about why the killings were taking place, that no one had the same idea about what he wanted done. This problem would blow up in Charles Manson's face within a month. But at the Hinman crime, Bobby Bosale knew exactly what Manson had planned. He knew all about the drug burn and the shooting of Bernard Crowe. He also understood that the killing of Gary Hinman was supposed to look like a Panther hit to throw pressure on them, so he wouldn't have time to come to the ranch. When Gary was killed, Bobby made Mary and me clean the house of anything that showed we'd been there. A vaguely revolutionary statement was left on the wall in Gary's own blood. Political piggy. And for the final touch, Bosale made a bloody palm print on the wall in the form of a panther paw. Since Charles Manson was desperate to get out of Spawn Ranch and head for the desert, he needed vehicles. So Bobby Bosale was directed to make Gary Hinman sign over the registration slips for his 2 cars. That Bobby actually did this was very foolish, because it made him the prime suspect. But perhaps it shows that, even at that point, Bobby Bosale didn't actually think Manson was going to insist he kill Gary. But this doesn't make much sense either, because Manson had already sliced Gary's face open from temple to chin with a machete, removing half of Gary's ear in the process. It was pretty obvious, no matter how much Gary Hinman liked Bobby, he was going to go to the police as soon as he got a chance. To show his devotion to the family, Charlie packed up his things and left unceremoniously the day after Gary was killed. He said he was just going out for a couple of days, but it was obvious he feared that the police would soon trace the murder to Spawn Ranch, as so he was running for the hills. 2 days later, the police still hadn't discovered Gary's body. But by now, Bobby Bosale had begun thinking. He'd been careful to wipe his fingerprints from everywhere in the house, where he might have put his hands, but couldn't he be identified by his bloody palm print as well? Of course he could. He raced back over to Gary's house and desperately tried to wipe the print from the wall, but apparently it wouldn't come off. Back at Spawn Ranch, Bobby Bosale must have been furious. He had been pushed into this by Manson, and now he felt caught. The possibility he'd been conned by Manson must have been in the back of his mind. Actually being found dead had been heard. No police had even come to ask questions about Crowe. And to top it all off, Charlie had packed up and split. Bosale loaded up one of Gary's cars and took off immediately without telling anyone, including his pregnant girlfriend, where he was going. Within a week, he was arrested, I believe, in San Jose, when police found him sleeping in Gary's car on the side of the road and ran the license number. That Bobby had the registration slip signed over to him might have saved him, but in his haste to leave the ranch, he'd driven off with not only his bloody clothes in the trunk, but with the knife he'd used to kill Gary as well. Back at Spawn Ranch, Charles Manson looked white as a ghost when he heard. If the charges stuck, Bosale might try to bargain with the DA. And what did Bobby Bosale have to bargain with? How about Bernard Crowe? Charles Manson must have felt as though his foot was caught in the door. Chapter 13. Selling your soul to save your skin. When Bobby Bosale was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail, Charles Manson sent people to go talk to him. It can only be imagined that Bobby Bosale gave them an earful report to report back to Manson. The gist of Bobby's comments was probably, "Take care of this or I'm not going down alone." That Manson was truly scared can be appreciated only by looking at his situation. He still had the police and the motorcycle gang breathing down his back. The Panthers were still as real and imminent a threat in his mind as ever. He still had his hands all over the Crowe shooting. But now Charles Manson couldn't even run to the desert. As long as Bosale was in jail, accused of the Hinman murder, Charles Manson was stuck. If Manson made a run for it, Bobby would assume Manson was throwing him to the lions, and Bobby might start thinking of making a deal with the police. To add insult to injury, the Hinman murder was not being associated with the Black Panthers at all, and it never was. The police hadn't the slightest idea what the bloody handprint was supposed to mean. If Charles Manson had felt hunted before, now he felt trapped and hunted. He couldn't go back to jail. Now the joint was filled with Black Panthers. Charles Manson wouldn't last a week if they found out about Crowe. Almost immediately after getting Bobby's messages, Manson drew the family together. He was more agitated than ever before. "The family has to get Bobby out," he said. "He's our brother. We'll do anything to get our brother out of jail." In hindsight, it is obvious that it was Charles Manson who had to get Bobby out of jail. Not because he was our brother either. But almost immediately, Manson ran into trouble. Most of the family had no idea what Bobby had actually done. Those who did still had completely different ideas about why Gary was killed. Manson told everyone something different. Now, those lies were coming back to him. He certainly couldn't tell them the truth. He didn't want to implicate himself in the Crowe matter any more than possible. He fell back to preaching about coming atrocities and Armageddon. Perhaps he was talking more about his own impending doom than anything else. It must have seemed as obvious to him now as a monster about to swallow him whole. But the stories no longer made any sense. The references to the Bible and mythical stories were disjointed and didn't follow. It was only by his own desperate intensity that he made the reasoning unquestionable. I saw the fear and desperate anxiousness in him, the spark that could turn so quickly into a violent rage. He sounded insane, but I wasn't going to question him. I'd seen him cut Gary Hinman's face open from brow to chin, and Gary had been a friend of Manson's. I knew I'd never been a friend. I wasn't going to say anything. But I started keeping my eyes open and looking for a way out. Chapter 14. A Desperate Plan. The idea that the Tate-LaBianca murders were in direct response to Charles Manson's fear of Bobby Bosale rolling on him, the copycat motive, is convincingly supported by the fact that on the morning of Friday, August 8th, 1969, Charles Manson sent Mary Bruner and Sandra Good out to buy escape supplies, including rope, for a breakout attempt at the Los Angeles County Jail. By mid-afternoon, the word had come back that Bruner and Good had been arrested for trying to buy the supplies with a stolen credit card. This should give the reader an indication of just how hard up for money Charles Manson was. He had counted on that money from Gary Hinman. The district attorney's investigation showed that it was during this time that Charles Manson even went back to beg the money from Dennis Wilson, the drummer for the Beach Boys, a longtime supporter of Manson's, who, when he told Manson he didn't have that kind of money laying around, he was threatened with the death of his son. It had been over a week and a half since Gary Hinman's death, and Charles Manson was at his wits' end. He was staying up for days at a time on drugs, watching for panthers. Guards were now posted all around Spahn Ranch, on the roofs of the buildings, on 24-hour watch. The women began to fear for their lives as paranoid, speed-frazzled gunmen combed the ranch, pointing handguns and rifles with shaking hands at anyone who made a loud noise. And now Mary and Sandra were in jail. Bobby was not a 14-year-old girl Manson could threaten or seduce into silence. And if Bobby started to think he was set up or that Manson wasn't doing whatever he could to get him out, there was no telling what he might do. Manson, on the other hand, had promised himself he was not going back to prison. He knew very well that going to prison for killing a Black Panther could be a death sentence. There was only one other way for Manson to get Bobby off the hook for the Hinman murder and thereby save his skin. That evening, he decided to put Plan B into effect. Chapter 15. Into the Maelstrom. Manson was very careful who he sent the night of August 8th, 1969. Once again, he took care, first, to choose people who couldn't say no. Charles Watson was young and quiet. He, like Bobby, had been worked on for over a week about how Manson and Bobby had gone the distance for the family. He was chemically dependent. He was beat over the head again and again with the fact that all this had started because of the drug burn that he, Watson, was in charge of and which had led the Black Panthers to Spahn Ranch. It was easy to guess the extent to which Manson made Watson feel he owed Manson. The second thing Manson was careful to do was to pick people who didn't have their hands dirty yet. And this is why I was chosen. Linda Kasabian and Patricia Krenwinkel were pushed into the car for the same reason. Though Linda had only been in the family for a month or two, she was picked for the same reason I had been sent to Gary Hinman's. Her 2-year-old daughter was being kept by Charles Manson, and a separate area of the ranch for her safety. Patricia Krenwinkel was chosen because she had nowhere to run to. She couldn't have left the family, no matter what Manson did. These choices were all deliberate, calculated, cold. His manipulation was expert once again, but his criminal planning was as faulty as with the killing of Gary Hinman. Once again, one of Manson's main problems was that he was still trying to avoid admitting to anyone he had shot and presumably killed a Black Panther. And so the manipulations began again. The killings were done for revolution. No, they were done for the environment. No, they were done because we all just love Bobby that much. No, they were done to start Helter Skelter. In reality, they were instigated by Charles Manson to save his own skin. And it very quickly became obvious how expendable the love of the family was to him. We were to do his dirty work, and then, if worse came to worse, be thrown to the fire like a human sacrifice to the Justice Department to pay for the sins of Charles Manson. So the bungling began. Charles Manson sent Watson to do a copycat killing, just like the killing of Gary Hinman. But Watson had never been to Gary Hinman's house. He didn't know anything about the killing. All he knew was that it was horrible. Bobby hadn't stuck around long enough to do much describing, other than to say that it was a terrible mess and that Hinman had been stabbed to death. Charlie himself knew little about the actual scene, so he simply told Watson to make it as gruesome as possible. Remembering that something had been written on the wall in Gary Hinman's blood, simply told the me and the other girls, write something witchy. Okay, but we still didn't know exactly what was going on. Pat, Linda, and I knew nothing about threats by the Black Panthers. We didn't know what these murders were supposed to throw suspicion back on the Panthers. All we knew was a vague story about Helter Skelter or revolution, or that these people were establishment people that should be hated. We weren't even told what was going to happen. We were simply told to go with Charles Watson and do what he said. Once we got to the Cielo Drive house, because I had been at the Hinman house, I was told to copy whatever had been written on the wall there. But all I could remember was pig, or that is all I could write without becoming physically sick. But it was not political piggy, which was what had been written at Gary Hinman's house. A paw print was not left, but the reason here might be obvious. That's what Bobby Bosale believed got him caught. In fact, nothing of a revolutionary nature was left this time. The killings were so witchy that no one had any idea what the motive was. In truth, the reason there was no obvious motive was because the people Charles Manson sent didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing. The outcome was that, just as with the Hinman killing, no one ever suspected the Black Panthers of the crime. What's even more pathetic, and definitely worse for Charles Manson, was that the killings were so gruesome, to use Charles Manson's word, that other than the fact that a knife had been used, they didn't resemble the Hinman crime at all. The next night, the same thing. Once again, Charles Manson handpicked the people he wanted to go. Charles Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel would take Leslie Van Houten out to dirty her hands. And because of our poor showing the night before, Linda Kasabian, who had run away, and I, who had lost my knife at the house and then froze, were forced to go again, this time taking Steve Grogan to dirty his hands. Leslie was specifically picked because she was originally one of Bobby Bosale's girls. Charlie wanted to make sure that, just in case her loyalty turned back to Bobby, and she decided to testify against Charles Manson at Bobby's trial, Manson would have something on her. Steve Grogan was picked because he was one of the men who had already heard about the Crowe shooting. He had also been on the boardwalk of Spawn Ranch when we had returned from Cielo Drive with blood on the car's door handles and steering wheel. Grogan already knew too much, and Manson wanted to make sure that, just in case Grogan ever thought about talking, Grogan would know he had something to lose as well. Manson wanted him all the way in or all the way out. But the killings the night before hadn't been what Manson had wanted. They hadn't been done right, as Manson put it. The news reports didn't even mention a connection to the Hinman crime, though Manson still wanted to distance himself from the killings as much as possible so he could slip away if the police ever caught up to the family. He felt he had to go along to show everyone what he had expected. At the LaBianca residence, he actually tied the couple up and robbed them, slipping out just before they were killed. That this action alone made him guilty of conspiracy as well as 2 accounts of first-degree murder shows his bungling. It also shows how unsophisticated he was about the law. But Charles Manson still knew less about how the Hinman murder was carried out than Mary Bruner or myself. He insisted in directing us in copying a murder about which he himself knew almost no details. The only thing Charles Manson knew for sure about the murder of Gary Hinman was that he'd cut his ear off. But Manson didn't remember to copy this. Once again, the LaBianca killings were much more extreme than the killing of Gary Hinman. For one thing, Leslie Van Houten hadn't participated during the killings, so she was told to go back after the crime and do more. This led to the problem, a problem as far as Charles Manson's copycat plan was concerned, that this crime had 10 times the number of wounds as the crime at Gary Hinman's. Once more, writing was left in blood, but this time no one who'd been at the Hinman residence was there to help make any similarities. Patricia Krenwinkel thought she remembered something about pigs, but she wasn't sure what it was. Death to pigs, Rise, and Helter Skelter were left instead. They sounded vaguely revolutionary, but Manson's reluctance to let anyone know what was going on backfired on him again. The reference to the Beatles' song Helter Skelter not only completely eliminated the Black Panthers as suspects, it was Manson's own calling card. The bungling goes on. To put further suspicion on the Black Panthers and convince the police the LaBianca killings were related to the Hinman case, Manson stole Miss LaBianca's wallet and let a Kasabian hid it in a gas station bathroom in a predominantly black neighborhood. Fortunately, she hid it so well, it wasn't found until long after we were all arrested. Not only wasn't this crime associated with the Black Panthers or the murder of Gary Hinman, it appears to be so different that it wasn't even associated with the Cielo Drive crimes. By the end of the weekend, even more innocent people were dead. But more to Manson's interest, he'd managed to suck another 8 members of his own family into the depravity of his own soul, just to make sure they couldn't turn him over about the shooting of Bernard Crowe. Spahn Ranch was now in complete paranoia. Guns, knives, suspicion was everywhere. There was still no money. There were still Panthers out there. The bikers actually came up to the ranch looking to beat up Manson, and he only scared them away with riflemen up on the roofs. The men practiced shooting out behind the ranch every day. The women were instructed to wear their knives. Everyone was supposed to wear dark clothing. Strangers, even hippies, were no longer welcome. Everything was coming apart so quickly. Charlie was walking around with his eyes wide open, double and triple checking his tracks to make sure he couldn't be caught. Did everyone wipe their fingerprints off? Did everyone get rid of their bloody clothing? Were the knives and guns discarded far from Spahn Ranch? Were the knives wiped clean of prints before they were being discarded? Things were bad. Real bad. It was as though we were drowning. Always a sick feeling inside. And I think that's how Manson must have felt. As though he had just barely had his head above water. If there was even the slightest ripple, he knew he'd go under. Once again, at this point of the book, just like Susan's other book, there are a few pages with pictures of her. So I'm just going to leave it up to myself later on to just edit a section and, show these pictures that are honestly rather common and pretty well known of her. But for the sake of completion for the book, I just like to show you. Chapter 16. The Sickening Sigh of Relief. Once again, the contention that Charles Manson's motive was to save his own skin by getting Bosale off the Hinman charge so Bosale wouldn't be tempted to implicate Manson is born out of the fact that the very next day Manson sent Linda Kasabian to go visit Bobby Bosale in jail. The message Manson told her to give was a simple one. Don't say anything. Everything's been taken care of. Spahn Ranch breathed a sigh of relief, but the churning, sickening feeling stayed. For Charles Manson, the killings represented no more than a calculated risk. To those in the family who had been ordered to carry them out, they were horrific, traumatic experiences that would not go away. And Spahn Ranch became a ghost town, with half dead, shocked specters drifting between the buildings. This is a fundamental difference between Charles Manson and all the other co-defendants related to the crimes. As far as I know, Charles Manson is the only one who has never shown any remorse. All the other co-defendants have, at some time over the last 35 years, gone through a complete emotional and psychological breakdown over what they witnessed and were a part of. I don't know if the true horror of those nights has ever struck him. And so, convinced that he'd freed himself from the threat of Bobby throwing him to the wolves, Charles Manson relaxed a little. There was still the need to get away from the ranch as soon as could be managed. Vehicles were being stolen and converted for desert use as quickly as possible. Charles Manson had expectations of making it to the desert within weeks, but it didn't happen. On August 16th, the police swarmed into Spawn Ranch with a warrant for evidence connecting us all to auto theft, and everyone ended up in jail. Manson must have had a heart attack when he saw those police flashlights. Even once he was assured the arrests were only for auto theft, there must have been an eerie forewarning as he was locked up in the county jail. He must have felt like he couldn't breathe. Chapter 17. A New Desperation. The auto theft arrests were eventually thrown out because the search warrant was old. That Charles Manson would have breathed a sigh of relief can only be imagined. If he did, it was a short one. Once back at the ranch, he became possessed with a plan to get out to the desert. This time in jail must have really shook him up. To get a true understanding of Charles Manson, it is worth pointing out that when arrested, he was still holding Linda Kasabian's 2-year-old daughter as security against her going to the police. Linda had stolen one of the vehicles from the ranch and was able to escape prior to the police raid, but only by abandoning her daughter. When everyone was put in jail, the child became a ward of the courts, as did my son. When Linda Kasabian found out about the arrests, she figured it would be safe to sneak back to Los Angeles and get her daughter from the courts without anyone from the family finding out. According to the prosecutor's account, she was horrified to hear from the caseworker that a young woman had already showed up to claim the child, but was refused when she couldn't provide any identification. This shows that Charles Manson knew exactly why he was holding on to those children. It was no coincidence that Linda Kasabian's child, as well as my own and that of Mary Bruner, were moved away from Spawn Ranch just at the time of the murders. It was not out of concern for the children that they were kept under guard night and day. It was a calculated and brutal form of manipulation. They were Charles Manson's security policy. Once out of jail, the first order of the day for Charles Manson was retribution. Donald Shorty Shea had been a ranch hand at Spawn Ranch ever since the family moved there the year before. He'd always been on cordial terms with Manson, but when Shea began to suspect that stolen cars were being stripped in the back of the ranch, his attitude changed. This had been right around the time Bernard Crowe had been shot. Now, Manson's frustration and anger were vented on Donald Shea. Whether Donald Shea actually had anything to do with the police raid or not has never been proved. I suspect if he had anything to do with it, Vincent Bugliosi would have found out and used it against Manson at the trial. But then, Shea's actual involvement didn't really matter. What's important was that Manson thought Shea was responsible for the raid. And the raid had sent Manson back almost to square one, as far as getting out of Spawn Ranch. In fact, it set him back even more, because now the police hung all over the ranch, just waiting for someone to step out of line. Manson struck back. Shea was reportedly decapitated and cut into pieces out behind the ranch, and then buried in several deep holes. His body wasn't discovered until almost 17 years later, when Steve Grogan agreed to cooperate with authorities. Once again, Manson arranged the killing for his own purposes. The main participant was Steve Grogan, who did not get his hands dirty on the night the LaBiancas were killed. That Grogan ended up dragged into murder was important to Manson because Grogan not only knew about Crowe, he now knew about the LaBianca killings, and he watched Manson greet those coming back from the Cielo Drive murders. The backup cast, those who either lured Shay out behind the ranch or helped clean up and bury him afterwards, included just about everyone not involved up to this point. Catherine Scher, Nancy Pittman, Sandra Good, and Lynette Fromey. Charles Manson's safety net, his ability to blackmail anyone who knows about his shooting Bernard Crowe, was almost completely in place. It goes without saying this period was nothing like the love-filled days in San Francisco or the first year in Los Angeles. That the atmosphere was still anything like communal is ridiculous. Those who could leave did. Linda Kasabian had already abandoned her daughter and fled. The friend I had traveled to Los Angeles with, Ella Jo, one of the original 6 girls in the family, had disappeared with her boyfriend without a word one morning after Gary Hinman was killed. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. TJ split immediately after the Crowe incident. Patricia Krenwinkel disappeared shortly after the Shay murder. Charles Watson stood up out of his nearly comatose state one day and simply vanished. Bruce Davis went into hiding. Paul Watkins ran off from the family's desert ranch. By the time the family was arrested in the desert, a month or two in the future, only a dozen or so members still remain out of a family that at one time held almost 40. Finally, ready or not, the family was moved to the desert. Manson could have gone much sooner on his own, but he was afraid to move without his bodyguard of followers. Supplies were sparse and conditions rough. More people tried to leave. Some were hunted down in the desert and brought back. Others were caught up to wherever they surfaced and warned to tell no one what they'd seen or heard. In Charles Manson's mind, the Panthers were now far behind, but the police are not. Caches of arms and gasoline are stored out in the desert sands in case it became necessary to escape through the deep desert. Once again, armed guards and sentries are posted everywhere. Manson claimed these were to protect us, but, as I've mentioned, the only time they went out in force is when a family member tried to escape. At the trial, Vincent Bugliosi claimed that all the guns and supplies were to allow the family to survive Helter Skelter. But the true reason for the pre-preparations was clearly the police, not Helter Skelter. While Charles Manson still talked a lot about revolution and Armageddon in order to cover his true motives, he also gave lectures on how to kill with a knife. More specifically, how to kill police officers that came around the ranch. He wasn't preparing for a black-white race war at all. And once again, Charles Manson must have felt he had to cover up not only the true motive for the quick move and the change in the family philosophy of love and acceptance, but for the bungling that took place in his murders. They weren't copycat murders now. They were supposed to throw fear into the establishment so they would leave us alone. Or they were supposed to make the establishment stand up and take notice. Or they were to start Helter Skelter. Or to scare Terry Melcher. Or to save the earth. I've never understood that one. But the desert was hard and ugly. Maybe it was just that everyone in the family felt hard and ugly on the inside. As I've said, all those directly involved in the murders were either in a state of shock or in hysterical overcompensation. Charles Manson's manipulations for drugs and power were falling apart. There were no drug connections in the desert, and his following was dwindling despite his armed guards. Those that were left were a tired and traumatized group who were ready to give up. There was also no one to steal from in the desert. No one to con. Money was very limited, but Manson was afraid to go back to the city. Luckily for everyone, our stay in the desert didn't last very long. Chapter 18. Last Daylight. When the police made their 3-day raid on Barker Ranch, where the family stayed, they picked up the pathetic remains of Charles Manson's family. It was the last free day Charles Manson ever had. He and about a dozen others, myself included, were put in jail, originally, once again, for grand theft auto. Eventually, once again, most were released. I was not. Someone had told the police that I knew something about a killing where someone's ear had been cut off. When the police told me I was under suspicion, I thought Bosale had finally started to talk, trying to barter his way out of jail. Instead, it was apparently one of the young girls who'd escaped from the desert hideout. Instead of being released with the others, I was transferred to Los Angeles to be questioned about Gary Hinman's death. Chapter 19. Pre-trial jail time. Most of what happened during this whole episode happened after I'd been arrested. In fact, after the bungling of the crimes, which covered a relatively short period of time, the wrangling and maneuvering and manipulation during the trial was where the real dramatics began. And that is where the myth of Helter Skelter began as well. My own actions during this time have been misrepresented to such an extent that they have effectively buried me. Up until now, there seemed little way of even attempting to lay out what really happened so that others could see it if they cared. First, it is important to note that everyone in the family, except for Bobby Bosale, Manson, and myself, have been set free. Watson had disappeared a week or so after the crimes, even before we headed out to the desert. Linda Kasabian had run off, stealing a truck and abandoning her daughter in her escape. Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, Bruce Davis, Catherine Scher, Lynette Fromey, and Sandra Good were all set free. This left me basically on my own in county jail. After several weeks, I elicited the unwanted attention of 2 middle-aged career criminals, Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard, who apparently decided they were attracted to me. In order to avoid them, I began talking about the biggest news on the television, the killing of Sharon Tate. Manson had spent much of his youth in correctional facilities, and during the growing paranoia after the crimes and into the desert, he'd continually preached to us that when you're in jail, you have to act tough in order to avoid getting targeted. You have to tell stories. You have to exaggerate to make yourself seem tougher and nastier than you are. So I exaggerated the only story I knew. I told them I knew who was responsible for the Tate crimes, and, in fact, I knew who killed Sharon Tate. It was me. I am not 21 years old anymore, nor am I naive. I am quite aware that claiming I was merely lying to avoid unwanted homosexual advances in county jail when I claim to have killed Sharon Tate is very self-serving. And I am well aware the reader has no reason to believe me or to take my word for it. And I don't want the reader to take my word for it. But then, I don't want the reader to take anyone else's word for it. Instead, I merely offer the facts as told by others. Manson had admitted he'd instructed everyone to act tough and tell stories in jail in order to survive if they were arrested. When the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, asked these women why they hadn't contacted the police immediately if they knew I'd killed Sharon Tate, they both said they thought it was obvious I had just been trying to act tough. It should be pointed out that even the prosecutor claimed these women weren't naive. They were career criminals, not likely to be fooled by a 21-year-old girl. Their assessment was that I'd been lying. Charles Watson also claimed that I'd been lying when I said I killed Sharon Tate. He stated this in 1976, and again in his own book, published in 1978. The district attorney admitted that others in the family had told investigators I had not killed Sharon Tate as well. And finally, though I realize it doesn't hold any weight, if you don't believe me anyway, I claimed this was a lie in 1975, and again in my own book, published in 1977. This is also the story I told the parole board even earlier in the 70s. I offer this merely to show you that this isn't Susan Atkins' new version of the crimes. If this is merely a self-serving story of mine, it is the same one I've been telling for over 30 years. Even if you don't believe me, at least give me credit for having the intelligence to not change my story every 3 years. That I was lying is further indicated by the fact that most of the other things I told the two women in jail have proven to be lies. The irony of the lie is that it had its desired effect. Both women avoided me from that point on. The downside was that several weeks later, I was invited to talk to the police about it. The opportunity was a godsend. It had been impossible to sit in jail with all that in my heart. I was going crazy, and the chance to get it out of me was a salvation in itself. In hindsight, it is interesting to point out that most people don't remember it was over 2 months after the crimes, and both the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department had absolutely no leads. It is perhaps impossible now to look back and realize how odd and frightening it was for the entire community to have such a widely publicized crime with absolutely no leads. It is with this backdrop that I suddenly told the LA District Attorney's Office I knew exactly who was responsible for the crimes, that the Tate and LaBianca crimes were connected, something they still didn't realize, and that a suspect they'd questioned and already dismissed was actually the author of those crimes. This revelation was such a bombshell that Vincent Bugliosi states in his account that without my testimony, they had no case at all. Without my testimony, they never would have been able to even indict Manson, let alone bring him to trial and convict him. The court appointed me a very conscientious attorney named Richard Caballero. He told me to keep quiet, and he'd make a deal with the prosecutor. But I didn't care by that time. The nightmare was still in my heart, and I had to let it out. In the end, despite my fears, I agreed to testify before the grand jury in order to indict Manson and the others responsible for the crimes. I didn't ask for any deal, and I didn't ask for anything in exchange. Despite the fact that without me, there would be no case against Manson at all, I was the only person who didn't demand to have all charges against them dropped in exchange for agreeing to testify for the prosecution. I would be the only one to testify and still accept responsibility and go to trial for my part. It is also worth pointing out that the public was putting an incredible amount of pressure on the police and the district attorney's office about this case. It was this public pressure that forced the district attorney's office to rush the case to the grand jury. And it's one of the reasons the myth of Helter Skelter was embraced before most of the facts of the case were uncovered. Mr. Caballero set up a meeting with the prosecutor. They explained to me they had come to an agreement. I would testify at the grand jury, but I wouldn't have to testify against Manson in open court. In addition, I would be isolated and protected from my co-defendants while I was in jail. I would still be tried for my part in the crimes, but my attorney had got the DA to agree they wouldn't seek the death penalty against me. The only stipulation was that I had to tell them the truth. If I didn't tell them the truth, they could invalidate the whole deal, use my own testimony against me, and I'd also face the death penalty. So I sat down and told Mr. Bugliosi the truth. The interview was conducted in Mr. Caballero's office and lasted only 2 hours. But here's the problem. I had been implicated in the crimes because I'd told 2 women in jail I had killed Sharon Tate. That had been so shocking to them that they eventually contacted the police. Now I was told I had to tell the police the truth or I'd be tried and executed. But the two were not the same. So I told Mr. Bugliosi the truth. I hadn't killed Sharon Tate. Years later, when he wrote his book about the crimes, Mr. Bugliosi stated he got the impression I was lying to him about this. He felt that I had, in fact, killed Sharon Tate. I have to admit that during the time of the trials, I did not like Mr. Bugliosi. It's hard to like someone who's a part of a system that took your son away from you. And it's hard to like someone who knew how much pressure you'd been under and yet still told people you were a blood-drinking vampire and who told you he'd have you executed if you didn't say and do what he wanted you to. Mr. Bugliosi was wrong about a lot of things, and he was wrong about me killing Sharon Tate. But with the grace of God, the 37 years of hindsight, I've come to respect the fact that, as far as I know, Mr. Bugliosi has always been careful to make it clear this is just his belief. This is what he believes. He doesn't claim to be God, and he doesn't claim to know what happened that night. Though this might sound like an odd point for me to stress, I assure you, if you are ever unlucky enough to find yourself on trial, there is a huge difference between a prosecutor who tells the jury he believes you did something you didn't, and a prosecutor who tells the jury he knows you did something you didn't. It's a question of integrity. Even though he's wrong about a lot of things, I'd never caught Mr. Bugliosi deliberately lying about anything. And so, after the interview, I was rushed to the grand jury. I told them what happened at the Cielo Drive and LaBianca crimes. I told them the truth. Charles Manson was indicted and charged with the crimes. So were Linda Kasabian, Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Charles Watson. It took a while for the police to find them all. Manson was still in jail, but the others had scattered across the country. Some of them I did not even know by their real names. Charles Watson was found in Texas, Patricia Krenwinkel in Alabama. Linda Kasabian had traveled to Salt Lake City and then onward to New York. She turned herself in when she heard on TV that she'd been indicted. And so, I had it all out of my heart for the first time in months. I could breathe again. And I thought that was the end of it. We'd be tried and found guilty, and that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Chapter 20. The Pressure Inside. It is interesting to note that even at this late stage in the game, Manson still believed he had a couple cards up his sleeve. As you will see, his manipulating and self-interest didn't stop or falter for a moment. In the end, I think you will see that, ironically, it was his own meddling in his case that cost him his freedom. You must remember, Manson has prepared for this eventuality from the start. Every step of the way, he had taken care to put distance between himself and the crimes he was organizing. Except for the Crowe blunder and his inability to keep from showing how it's done on the night of the LaBianca murders, he did pretty well at keeping himself covered. He'd also gone to great lengths to see that everyone who could possibly turn on him had their hands dirty as well. Right away, Charles Manson began to organize a network with which to run the family from jail. Over the next couple years, this network will be the means by which Charles Manson threatens witnesses, orders people to give and recant testimony, directs lawyers, orders jailbreaks, directs robberies, and even attempted murders. Through members of the family not charged with the crimes, namely Lynette Fromey and Sandra Good, Charles Manson began fabricating his defense. And his defense primarily involved sacrificing everyone else to the flames. His first defense was, of course, to deny any knowledge of the crimes. When I go to the grand jury and implicate him, his response is fast and brutal. My attorney, Richard Caballero, receives death threats. I receive visits from friends who suggest it might be in my own best interest for me to recant my testimony. I receive endless harassing letters. Threats to my life were posted around the jail. And though I was supposed to be held incommunicado, Cher gets herself arrested and put on my floor of the jail to scream and yell at me for a day and a half. I was a snitch. I was dead. Charlie wanted to see me. If I came back, everything would be forgiven. And finally, I was reminded they could still find my son. If one reads Mr. Bugliosi's account of the crimes, there's something odd that doesn't pop out unless one is paying close attention. It is something that obviously didn't occur to Mr. Bugliosi. My son had been taken by social services after I was arrested during the police raid at Spawn Ranch. So had Mary Bruner's son and Linda Kasabian's daughter. As I already mentioned, Linda Kasabian heard about the arrests and returned to Los Angeles to retrieve her daughter. She was horrified to hear from the social worker that a young woman claiming to be Linda had showed up and tried to collect the child, but had been turned away because she hadn't had any identification. Mary Bruner had been able to get her son from social services when the grand theft auto charges were dropped once she was released from jail. This is because Mary still had a driver's license. But I didn't have a driver's license. Mr. Bugliosi knows this. This is one of the reasons Linda was forced to drive to the Tate house. She was the only one who had a valid driver's license. Mary Bruner was in jail at the time for using a stolen credit card. But when I was arrested again in the desert, my son was taken into custody again, which means that although I didn't have any identification, Charles Manson made sure my son was retrieved and remained under his control. This never occurred to the prosecutor, but this is very important. The way it happened is that Manson sent me to social services to find out where my son was. I then visited him several times at the home of the couple who were taking care of him. Despite the fact that I had no identification, it was clear to them that he was my son. Then Manson had 4 men take me to visit my son one afternoon after I left. And after I left, they brought me back in the evening, prepared to steal my son away. But I found the window to his room wide open without a screen, and him standing up in his crib looking toward the window as though waiting for me. Over the years, I have come to believe that the couple knew I was going to come back for him, and they left the windows open like that on purpose. But as soon as I got him, I was ushered back into the car and driven back to Manson. My son was taken out of my hands and returned to where the other children were being kept for his safety. This isn't a breathtaking story, except that years later I'm still taunted by district attorneys who imply I'm lying when I say I was threatened with the life of my son while I was in jail. They claim my son was safely in the care of social services. No one could harm him. But if Manson had been able to find where my son was once, he could find him again, and he could send people to get him. In the end, Manson's insistence that I recant my grand jury testimony shows a very naive understanding of the legal system. He believed that since my grand jury testimony was the only real evidence against him, if I recanted my testimony, the charges would have to be dropped, and he would have to be released. I put up with this pressure for months. Through his minions and then later in person, Charles Manson told me it would be better for everyone, including myself and my son, if I recanted my grand jury testimony. He said the DA had no real evidence against any of us, and once I recanted my testimony, we'd all be set free. Charles Manson's reasoning was clear. The only implication the district attorney had on him was me. As for the claim that we would all be set free, in truth, the only one who had any real evidence against them was me. Due to my talking to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard, if I recanted my testimony, I would become the focal point of the DA's whole case. But this didn't matter to Charles Manson. For a man who insisted he loved his family and would give his life for any of its members, he didn't seem to have any qualms about using my son to force me to let go of my one chance of avoiding the death penalty. And all just so he could beat a rap and not take responsibility for a crime I had already confessed to. In the end, I succumbed. But I have to point out the position I was in was not a very nice one. I was being promised by Manson that if I didn't do what he told me to, I wouldn't live a year in prison, and possibly my son would be harmed as well. On the other side, I was being promised by the prosecutor that if I didn't do what he told me to, I would be executed. In the end, it became very clear. I'd seen what Charles Manson was capable of doing, even to friends like Gary Hinman, and I knew he never considered me a friend. I also knew Mr. Bugliosi still had to prove his case. In the spring of 1970, there was a real chance he might not be able to do this. I recanted my testimony. In the 36 years that have followed this moment in my life, I have been constantly vilified for my decision. The fact that I was the one who got Charles Manson indicted, and the fact that I was the one who told the Los Angeles Police Department he was even connected to the crimes, is regularly dismissed due to my recanting. At my parole hearings, the district attorney regularly asserts it shows my willing and deliberate commitment to Charles Manson. When I claim my recanting was the product of coercion and fear, they usually scoff. The truth is, Mr. Bugliosi himself claims to have been given up to 3 bodyguards during the trial, and his family was moved into a safe house in response to threats against his life. He also claims our judge was given 3 bodyguards, had a 24-hour guard on his home, and carried a loaded gun under his judicial robes. Both my attorneys, Caballero as well as Shin, had their lives threatened. Patricia Krenwinkel's attorney had his life threatened. According to the prosecutor, Leslie Van Houten's attorney was actually killed at Manson's command. And all of this was while Manson was locked away in jail. Most of the family members were still free at that time. This included Lynette Fromey and Sandra Good, whom the prosecutor claimed followed him around with a knife, as well as Bruce Davis and Steve Grogan, both of whom would eventually be convicted and recommended for death by their juries. There were very real reasons to fear Charles Manson, even while he was incarcerated, and the district's attorney office knew this. Chapter 21. Being thrown away by both sides. I recanted my testimony and immediately heard that despite Manson's assurances we'd all be freed, instead the district attorney merely made a new deal with Linda Kasabian. Now she was going to be their evidence. I was still going to face trial, but now I was going to face the death penalty too. But suddenly it became very clear. I'd been promised not merely immunity from the death penalty, I'd been promised protection and isolation from my co-defendants. The district attorney knew I was receiving visits from known family members while supposedly being held incommunicado. And he knew Catherine Sherritt had been placed on my floor and on my hall of the Los Angeles County Jail, which had 4 floors of jail cells, and that she was allowed to yell threats down at me for the better part of 2 days. They knew threatening signs were being hung on the walls of the jail, indicating I was a snitch, and they knew this was pushing me closer and closer to recanting. In hindsight, I've come to believe this is exactly what the prosecution wanted, and there are several good reasons for this belief. In California, you can't use the testimony of one defendant against their co-defendants unless there was some corroborating evidence. That means you have to have at least one other piece of evidence to indicate the testimony of the co-defendant is truthful. In my case, though I was the one responsible for Charles Manson being indicted and charged, and though I was the one who told the district attorney's office what happened and who was involved, my testimony could only go so far at trial. My testimony could be used against Charles Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel because the police had found a fingerprint from both of them at the crime scene. And Leslie Van Houten had spoken to another girl at the ranch about the LaBianca crime. Charles Manson himself had several vaguely incriminating remarks to various people indicating his connection to the crimes. This provided the corroborating evidence that would allow my testimony to be used against them. But the prosecutor had no corroborating evidence against Linda Kasabian. This meant he wouldn't be able to use my testimony against her, and he didn't have anything else. In the end, it was obvious the district attorney would rather have made a deal with Linda from the start. They believed they weren't going to be able to prosecute her anyway. But unfortunately for the DA, Linda hadn't come forward until she'd been indicted. I, on the other hand, was different. If I could be induced to recount my testimony and therefore invalidate my deal, what I'd said to the women in county jail could be used as corroborating evidence for anything Linda said against me. Vincent Bugliosi admitted to being angered when he found the DA's office had offered me a deal. Why? Because he was horrified by my participation in the crimes? No. Because from the DA's point of view, I was the only one he felt he had a good chance of prosecuting, thanks to my statements to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard. He would much rather have chosen Linda, against whom he had no corroborating evidence, as the one he'd have offered immunity to. From a prosecutorial point of view, it just made sense to try to get rid of me. When I finally did recant my testimony, Manson's first question to me was, "Have you gotten to Linda?" His foremost interest was still himself. But unlike me, Linda Kasabian couldn't be threatened. Manson couldn't get to her daughter. She was with Linda's family. And Manson couldn't threaten Linda with harm when she got to prison. Unlike me, Linda had demanded complete immunity in return for testifying, meaning she wouldn't even be tried for the crimes and would never go to prison for her part in them. Also, unlike me, she was being given real protection and isolation from her co-defendants. An indication of how the district attorney's office could have prevented me from suffering the pressures I did when they left me in the jail is seen in how differently they handled Linda Kasabian. The prosecutor himself went straight over to the jail the very day he made the deal with Linda and talked to the sheriff in charge and had her put in isolation. True isolation, on a separate floor from all the other people in jail, and he kept her there for the entire trial. This makes the fact they left me in the main jail population, even though they knew I was being threatened and pressured, a good indicator they knew what they were doing. They knew I was being pushed closer and closer to recanting. Another indicator the district attorney's office wasn't being entirely honest with me is the fact that they only interviewed me once for 2 hours. They later claimed my deal would have been invalidated even if I hadn't recanted, simply because I had not been entirely truthful with them. When they clarified what not entirely truthful meant, they claimed I hadn't told them Manson had taken Linda Kasabian, Steve Grogan, and me out to Venice Beach after the LaBiancas and ordered us to kill a friend of Linda's. The truth is, I hadn't told the prosecutor about that event because the interview never touched on it. The prosecutor was the one asking the questions, and he never asked about it. Compared to the issues he was talking to me about, it didn't seem relevant, especially as we hadn't done it. And the prosecutor only talked to me for 2 hours. It never came up. The prosecutor's claim that I deliberately omitted this is highly suspect, and I think he knows that. Mr. Bugliosi himself confesses he rarely interviews witnesses just once, usually going back to talk to them 4 or 5 times because they often overlook things they remember later. This indicates he knew perfectly well if he only interviewed me once, there was a very good chance he could find something we hadn't covered. Then he could use that to claim I was not entirely truthful, and use that to invalidate my deal. In contrast, as soon as he made a deal with Linda, he started interviewing her regularly. He claims to have spent as many as 50 hours interviewing her, some of these interviews lasting up to 9 hours. In addition, he gave her a pad of paper and told her to write down anything she'd overlooked when they talked. He claims some of the letters she wrote him were 10 or more pages long. In fact, even minor witnesses were interviewed for hours and hours. I was the witness Mr. Bugliosi claimed without which they had no case at all, and yet he interviewed me only once, and only for 2 hours. And then he claimed I hadn't told him everything. Another interesting quirk about the DA's decision to get me to recant is that they now didn't have anyone to testify against the Hinman case either. So they not only had to give Linda Kasabian complete immunity for her part in the 7 Tate-LaBianca killings, they now had to make a deal with Mary Brunner to get her to testify against Bobby Bosale about Gary Hinman's killing. Following Linda's example, Mary Brunner demanded and had to be given complete immunity for her part in Gary's death. It's worth pointing out that in the end, I was the only person who agreed to testify against Manson without demanding complete immunity. Everyone else who had anything over them demanded complete immunity. From Linda Kasabian to Rodney Howard and Virginia Graham, from Danny DiCarlo to Mary Brunner. I was the only one who testified about my part in the crimes and still accepted responsibility for them. But this is not an indictment of Linda. Linda did what she should have done, but she had a lot of advantages that I did not. Her daughter was now in the hands of her family on the East Coast. She was held in Communicado, true incommunicado. No one was allowed to see her. No one was allowed to talk to her for 9 months. Charles Manson had made another incredible blunder. If he had left me as the DA's main witness, he would have been able to continue to threaten me with my son and undermine the prosecution's attack. Now there was no way for him to touch the DA's main witness. But his goal was obvious. With my testimony recanted, he immediately called for a dismissal of the charges against him. That I was still implicated by my talking to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard, and therefore now faced 8 counts of first-degree murder and the death penalty, didn't bother him at all. I was disposable. As suddenly I realized I'd been thrown away by the DA's office at that point, when I was no longer useful to them. And I was being thrown away by Manson now that I was no longer needed by him. Neither side had ever wanted me. Chapter 22. The Selling of Bobby Bosale. Bobby Bosale's first trial had ended in a hung jury, but the investigation into the Tate-LaBianca murders was still turning up more evidence and more people who knew about the death of Gary. Mary Brunner was identified and charged as a co-defendant for the murder of Gary Hinman. Manson must have begun to suspect that Bosale was thinking of making a deal. Manson decided to throw Bobby to the wolves. Mary Brunner was told to make a deal with the DA's office. At Bobby Bosale's second trial, Mary insisted that Bobby had acted on his own, that no one had prompted his killing of Gary Hinman. Bobby must have never realized what was happening to his brother, Charles Manson, stabbing him in the back. In response, Bobby took the stand himself and declared that Manson was responsible for the murder. This is exactly what Manson had feared Bosale would do from the beginning, and it was exactly what he didn't need right now. But it was too late for Bosale. He was convicted of first-degree murder. Charles Manson had orchestrated the killing of Gary Hinman perfectly. By the time Bosale realized he was being thrown to the wolves, his credibility was destroyed and he couldn't even finger Manson convincingly. But Manson was still afraid of being fingered for Crowe, the only murder he didn't think he could worm his way out of. And so he immediately sent Mary Brunner back to recant her testimony in order to pacify Bobby. Then Bobby Bosale moved for a mistrial and release, claiming Mary's testimony was the only evidence against him. He was denied, and Manson was left to worry about whether Bosale would turn to the DA's office about the Crowe incident. So far in the investigation of the Tate-LaBianca murders, the DA, Vincent Bugliosi, was digging as deep as he could for a motive and finding nothing but talk of revolution, environmentalism, and helter-skelter. Charles Manson must have smiled. There was nothing about Bernard Crowe. All that nonsense Manson had been spewing for months had paid off. All the stupid people who had trusted him to lead them were so confused as to what the murders were actually about that Bugliosi was getting nothing but nonsense. Charles Manson knew he couldn't possibly be convicted on that. No one would believe that. No one would believe he had tried to instigate a race war to gain control of the world. And once a jury scoffed at that, Manson would simply show there was no proof he was at Gary Hinman's house or the Cielo Drive residence, and he'd left the LaBianca residence before anyone was hurt. He was in the clear. To this end, he continued to actively uphold the helter-skelter motive himself. In interviews with the press, Manson spoke of revolution, society's ills, and the need to call the attention of the whole world. He instructed Lynette Fromey and Sandra Good and the members of the family, still free, to stir the media up with claims that the murders were symbolic acts of revenge for the destruction of the planet. The girls who held vigil outside the courthouse were instructed to fill the newspapers with threats of impending doom and retaliation if he, Manson, was convicted. In the end, Manson believed he would insist it was the girls' ridiculous ideas that had prompted the killings, and he had nothing to do with any of it, and he would slip away and leave us to die. Manson must have smiled, but he was missing something. His lust for media attention and his ironclad control of his co-defendant's legal representation was beginning to show through. He didn't realize, but the jury was beginning to see the extent of his control and manipulation of the family. And the bizarre courtroom antics he arranged to make my co-defendants and me look crazy and wild were beginning to backfire as the jury and the press slowly became convinced the family was just crazy enough to actually believe in Helter Skelter. Perhaps the murders were committed due solely upon the deranged delusions of a madman. It must be mentioned that in the fall of 1969, at the time of his arraignment for the Tate-LaBianca murders, Charles Manson was almost universally believed by the professional and legal communities to be either completely innocent of the crimes or in a position that he could never be successfully prosecuted for them. And this was probably true. There was no physical evidence or sound motive connecting Charles Manson to the crimes. What eventually put Charles Manson on death row was his own foolish interruption of his legal defense. If, from the start, he had just let his state-appointed lawyers do their jobs, he probably would have not ended up in prison. That is, until he got caught for something else. But his involvement with his own legal representation not only confounded and undermined his lawyers, it made his controlling and manipulating nature more and more obvious. Toward the end of the guilt phase of the trial, it began to look as though the jury, and certainly the press, might actually be taking the helter-skelter motive seriously. But Charles Manson was so wound up in the media blitz and being the center of attention, he didn't even notice his twilight was coming. Chapter 23. And the heavens cried. Sometime toward the end of the guilt phase of the trial, something occurred which only merited a minor note from the prosecuting attorney, Vincent Bugliosi. The fact that Vincent Bugliosi didn't realize the true significance of this shows his lack of understanding of the crimes. While being escorted between jail and court, it is reported that Charles Manson was led down one of the halls of justice when he met another prisoner being led in the other direction. It was Bernard Crowe. Vincent Bugliosi reported that the sheriffs escorting Manson said he turned to Crowe and said, "Sorry I had to do it, but you know how it is." This exchange alone, if true, undermines Manson's claim that the shooting was in self-defense. No apology would have been necessary. The true irony of this moment can only be appreciated if one understands the real reason all the killings began: to get money so Manson could run away from the police and the Black Panthers, who he was sure was coming after him for killing Bernard Crowe. At this one moment, it must have all became obvious to Charles Manson. Bernard Crowe wasn't dead. Manson hadn't killed anyone that day. What's worse, it must have been immediately obvious to Manson that Bernard Crowe had never mentioned the shooting to the police, and none of Crowe's friends had either. And no Panthers had ever gone up to wipe out Spawn Ranch. Bernard Crowe must not even know any Panthers. That was the moment when the true horror and tragedy of all those murders should have come to Manson. That was the moment it became obvious that when Charles Manson had ordered for the murder of Gary Hindman, no one, not the police or the Panthers, was pursuing him. There had been no need for desperation. There had been no need for money to flee. And there had been no need for Gary Hindman to die. So Charles Manson's fears about Crowe led to the completely unnecessary murder of Gary Hindman. Bobby Bosale's arrest for the murder of Gary led to the horrific murders at the Cielo Drive residence and the LaBianca residence. The murders at the Cielo Drive and LaBianca residences led ultimately to the murder of Donald Shea, and all of it was for nothing. Seeing Bernard Crowe alive and in police custody should have sent a sickening chill through Charles Manson. The horror of 9 innocent people dead should have filled him, but I don't know if it did. What I really think troubled him was the thought that Crowe might press charges or push a hit out on him. On a personal note, I have often wished I could have been there when this exchange took place. To see the look on Charles Manson's face at the moment when he realized 9 people had died and 8 more were on their way to death row for nothing. All for nothing. I would have liked to see if even a flicker of recognition of that horror showed on his face for even a second. Some sign that for one moment in his life, he actually cared about those people. And the heavens must have cried. Chapter 24. The Lies That Bind. Toward the end of the guilt phase of the trial, Manson should have realized things weren't going well. He tied his lawyers' hands and insisted on controlling everything they did in court, even though he knew nothing about the law or legal proceedings, and he'd foiled their every attempt to help him. And this was despite the fact that 9 months ago, 90% of the legal community believed there would be no way to convict Manson. But those people had underestimated Charles Manson's need to control everyone around him, even when he didn't know what he was doing. At the end of the guilt phase of the trial, Charles Manson got the shock of his life when he found out he'd actually been convicted for the murders of the 7 people at the Cielo Drive and LaBianca residences. And he thought he'd been so careful to distance himself from the murders. The immaturity of his knowledge about the law can be seen in his lack of understanding that just his knowledge that the murders were going to take place and his efforts to cover them up afterwards, even without the fact that he'd orchestrated them, made him an accessory to the murders and therefore legally culpable. The fact that he'd helped tied up the LaBiancas made his part in the murders active and premeditated. So he shouldn't have been surprised. But to someone who thought he was the only one who mattered in the world, this blow must have been tremendous. and he'd been convicted with that ridiculous nonsense about Helter Skelter at that. Chapter 25. The Penalty Plan. Having been convicted, Manson changed his strategy going into the penalty phase of the trial. In California, a guilty verdict during the guilt phase of the trial is followed by a penalty phase, where the jury determines the penalty imposed. In the case of first-degree murder in 1969, choice was between 7 years to life in prison or the death penalty. During the trial, Manson had been careful to tie the hands of his co-defendants. He had forced each of us to fire our court-appointed attorneys and to hire attorneys who had solicited Manson. The result was that Manson had 4 attorneys, and my co-defendants and I had none. This meant that during the trial, Manson prevented any of us from putting forth a defense. The reason is obvious. What could our attorneys have said other than, "These young women were forced into the crimes by the machine-wielding maniac Charles Manson"? Charles Manson's hopes of being found not guilty rested squarely on me and my co-defendants taking the full weight of responsibility for the crimes. He didn't want us to have a defense. We were expendable. We were slated to die. But having been found guilty, Manson had to totally overhaul his strategy. He was now already implicated in the Hinman murder, so hiding the copycat motive was no longer necessary. He also now knew he hadn't killed Bernard Crowe, so he didn't have to worry about the police finding out about that. He now believed his best lay in throwing doubt upon the Helter Skelter motive he'd originally been so happy to see the prosecution latch onto. He'd also take every opportunity to try to slander the prosecution's main witness, Linda Kasabian. This is one of the reasons why my case is so strange. It was handled completely backwards. Our defense lawyers put forth no defense during trial, and then the entire defense was laid out during the penalty phase. This is one of the reasons why 37 years later, no matter what I say, skeptics can claim nothing like this was ever brought out at the trial. And they're entirely correct, because no defense was brought out at the trial. So this was the new plan Manson unfolded for the penalty phase. It was based on one of the most elementary manipulative tricks of them all. Mix your lies with a lot of truth. The copycat motive would be uncovered and admitted, but with a few novel changes that would suit Charles Manson. First and foremost, the defense would claim Manson didn't have anything to do with the planning of the murders. The man who told people in the family what to wear, how to cut their hair, and broke chairs over people's heads if they talked when he didn't want them to, was now to be portrayed as an innocent bystander to the most all-encompassing decision ever made by the family. A completely ridiculous story to anyone who had ever been in the family or even seen the family. But would the jury buy it? The second most important change was that Linda Kasabian would be portrayed as the main ringleader in the murders. This would help discredit her as a witness against Manson and give the illusion she was fingering Manson just to remove herself from the picture as much as possible. Once again, to anyone who knew the family or Linda Kasabian, the charge was ridiculous. It should be pointed out that Linda Kasabian was not the angel Vincent Bugliosi claimed she was. She was the only one besides Charles Manson himself to drive the family to the crime scenes, and she was the only one to hide the weapons after the Cielo Drive crimes. But she was certainly not responsible or culpable in any way for the murders. She was just as frightened and unwilling as the rest of us. During the Cielo Drive murders, she actually ran away, and the next night she deliberately steered Charles Manson away from potential victims in order to avoid any bloodshed. But the true absurdity of Charles Manson's claim that Linda was the ringleader for the murders could be seen in the fact that she'd only been with the family for about 2 months. Certainly no one who knew anything about the family would have thought for a second she would have been able to usurp power over the family from Manson. But the jury didn't know the family. Would they believe it? The rest of the copycat motive would be left as close to the truth as possible, so there would be sufficient corroborating evidence. The final fictional version would run something like this. Linda Kasabian was madly in love with Bobby Bosale. When Bosale was arrested, she became frantic to find a way to free him. She came up with the idea of performing copycat murders so the police would see the murders were continuing and conclude they must have arrested the wrong man. Bosale would be freed and the family would be back together, and she could be with Bosale again. She had convinced the other girls in the family, and together they had lured the men in to help them, and all without breathing a word to Manson. Immediately, Manson began dictating his version of the story to the members of the family who weren't arrested, namely Lynette Fromey, Sandra Good, and Catherine Scher. He would then have his lawyers call these people as witnesses during the penalty phase of the trial to try to sell the story to the jury. And this is what he did. The problem was that most of these girls weren't closely related to the group who had gone out on the nights of August 8th and 9th. That whole group was now in jail. So it was easy for the prosecution to shed doubt, not only on their testimony, but on their motives and credibility as well. To make things worse, many of the girls called to testify didn't have the story down straight, and others overreacted. This just gave the jury the impression Charles Manson was orchestrating a cover-up, which is exactly what he was doing. Worse still for Charles Manson, it showed the jury, once again, the depth of his manipulation and control over the people in his family. It became more than obvious he did have the power to order people murdered, and no one in the family would have done anything he hadn't told them to do. No one would have taken control away from him. Not Watson, and certainly not a 21-year-old Linda Kasabian. The odd thing about all of this is that the prosecution knew this version of the copycat motive wasn't true. But by now, they also knew about the connection between Gary Hinman's death and the Tate-LaBianca killings. And they even knew about the incident with Bernard Crowe. So they knew the Helter Skelter motive was at least somewhat, if not completely, wrong. But they'd gone to the moon and back to sell the Helter Skelter theory, and the jury had believed it. The prosecution couldn't possibly admit that perhaps Helter Skelter wasn't the motive. They would have lost all credibility. And this could all be traced back to the public pressure the district attorney's office had been under, which forced them to rush the case to the grand jury before they fully understood everything that had happened. This book, of course, is meant to address this mistake. But in the case of the prosecution, it meant they were locked into the Helter Skelter theory from that moment on. They were stuck with Helter Skelter. Chapter 26. Suicide on Command. When it became obvious the poorly rehearsed and disjointed testimony of these girls wasn't going to be enough to get Charles Manson off the hook, he did something that showed his character much more clearly than anything other than the murder of Gary Hinman, the man who helped feed his son. When Lynette Fromey, Sandra Good, and Catherine Scher perjured themselves on the stand for Charles Manson during the penalty phase of the trial, they did so with little or nothing to lose. But when he came to Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and myself and told us we were going to have to get on the stand and claim we had deliberately and remorselessly, and with no direction from him at all, committed all the murders ourselves, he was basically telling us to commit suicide. That this request came so easy for him was probably the nastiest point in my life at that time. That he was brutal and cruel at times I already knew. That he was capable of murder, even the murder of a friend, I had known since watching him take a swing at Gary Hinman's head with a machete. That it appeared I was being set up for the murders ever since recanting my grand jury testimony was a thought I had tried to keep from my mind. I had always assured myself, though cruelty and brutality seemed to surface in Manson at times, it was only because of the dire straits we had been in at Spawn Ranch. I had assured myself that all those words Manson had said about one big family, where everyone cared about everyone else and was willing to make sacrifices for one another, were true. That day, I had to stop pretending and face the fact that all those sentiments were nothing but words to Charles Manson. The 2.5 years I had spent with this family overcoming adversity, struggling to get along, struggling to make ends meet, partying, hoping for the future, enjoying his dreams of being a musician, and scrimping through the hard times meant absolutely nothing to Charles Manson. I meant nothing to Charles Manson. None of the young people who'd come to follow and look up to Charles Manson meant anything to him. They were all expendable. That was the day I really began to understand Charles Manson the way I do today, the way I'm showing him in this book. By this time in the trial, I no longer even had my conscientious attorney, Richard Caballero, to turn to. I had replaced him, at Manson's order, with one of Charles Manson's attorneys, Day Shin. Both of my co-defendants had replaced their lawyers with one of Charles Manson's lawyers as well. Patricia Krenwinkel's attorney had simply been converted. At this point in the trial, and faced with Manson's request, there was nowhere at all to turn. Throughout the whole trial, I had been hoping Manson and the lawyers had some idea what they were doing. Charles Manson always said everything was going to work out all right. I didn't realize what he meant was everything was going to work out all right for him, because if worst came to worst, he had a backup plan. That his plan was simply to sacrifice my co-defendants and me was an idea I refused to accept up to that point. We should have refused. But Charles Manson was an expert manipulator. He'd waited to the end to tell us this was his backup plan on purpose. By this time in the trial, he said, there was only one hope for all of us, and that was to discredit the prosecution's case. We couldn't defend ourselves from all his charges, Manson said, but we could throw dirt on Linda Kasabian and completely undermine the Helter Skelter motive. If we could convince the jury the prosecution was completely wrong about the motive for the murders, there was a chance they could be persuaded they hadn't been given the whole story. They may have come to believe there might be mitigating circumstances the prosecution hid. This tactic didn't work. All 4 of us ended up on death row. But Manson should have known it wouldn't work. He made the same mistake he had with the testimony from the other girls in the family. Our stories were thrown together and poorly rehearsed, and they were obviously concocted for the sole purpose of slandering Linda Kasabian and removing Charles Manson from the crimes. And they were only more proof to the jury that Charles Manson was in complete control of the family, even unto death. Charles Manson had been beat, or rather, he beat himself. Once again, it illustrates the self-interested purpose of Charles Manson to point out that during the penalty phase of the Tate-LaBianca trial, he did not only instructed us to confess to those murders, but he made us confess to the murder of Gary Hinman. This was a completely uncorroborated story, and it was ridiculous for many reasons. The most obvious being that neither Patricia Krenwinkel or Leslie Van Houten had even been to Gary Hinman's home. What's more, Mary Brunner had already testified it was Bobby Bosale who killed Gary Hinman. And Bobby Bosale, in an attempt to extricate himself, had claimed Manson had killed Gary. Both accounts made it very unlikely my co-defendants or I could have done it. After all, if Bosale was trying to save his skin, it would have been a lot easier to claim I had killed Gary than to have claimed anyone else had. And it would have been the first thing on his mind if I actually had killed Gary. But what makes this maneuver interesting is that Manson was already trying to expedite himself from being convicted for the murder of Gary Hinman even before he'd been charged with Gary's death. He was already trying to set up a defense. His first plan had been simply to distance himself physically from the murders. Now it was obvious the ridiculous Helter Skelter motive could be used to convict him, even though he wasn't at the crime scene when the murders took place. But that had been his whole master plan. He'd gone to a lot of trouble to distance himself physically from the murders, and now it wouldn't help him at all. So now my co-defendants and I had to swear we killed Gary Hinman without Manson's encouragement. In fact, now the death of Gary Hinman was changed to look more like self-defense. But the whole story now was so ridiculous, nobody believed it. Even subtler is the fact that Charles Manson was trying to get us to admit to the murder of Gary without Bobby being involved. The reason for this can be understood only if one tries to think what Manson would gain by this. He now knew he would be tried for Gary Hinman's death, and he knew he could be convicted if it could be shown he had instigated the killing. He knew his 3 co-defendants could be forced to confess he had no part in the killing. But what about Bobby Bosale? Bosale had already let Manson know if he was convicted, he'd implicate Manson, and now he was convicted. Bobby Bosale had also already testified unconvincingly at his second trial that Manson had done the killing. It was obvious Charles Manson was trying to throw Bobby Bosale a bone. If Charles Manson could force us to take the heat for Bobby Bosale, he might be able to convince Bobby not to testify against him. Manson might still be able to worm his way out of that charge. Once again, this ploy didn't work. And once again, this was due mostly to poor storytelling by myself and my co-defendants. But what is of interest is the depth of Manson's manipulations. Another example of Manson's cold calculations was his attempt, in the later stages of trial, to force Catherine Scher to tell everyone she was carrying his child. Her child was not Manson's son, and he knew it. He was simply trying to play on the hearts of the public and the jury members right before they were to decide whether to sentence him to death. In the end, my testimony and the testimony of my co-defendants was a joke. Our lawyers, learning that we intended to implicate ourselves, refused to question us. When we finally were allowed to give statements, none of the stories worked together. They contradicted each other. They didn't make sense. But by this time, I didn't really care. I was testifying simply to protect myself and to get Manson off my back. I didn't care if the stories didn't make sense. I didn't care if they weren't convincing. And I honestly didn't care if the jury believed them. I was already convicted and looking at the death penalty. Why should Manson walk away free? This is also when I was told to say I killed Sharon Tate. The reason Manson told me to claim it was me who killed Sharon Tate would be obvious. Just like when Manson made us confess to killing Gary Hinman without Bosale in order to buy Bobby's silence, if Manson was charged with Gary's death, Manson was making us confess to killing everyone at the Cielo Drive and LaBianca homes without Charles Watson. If Manson could get us to take responsibility for those crimes without Watson being involved, then that would give Watson a defense when he finally faced trial. Manson was still planning on appealing his case, and what he didn't want to happen was to successfully appeal his conviction and then have the DAs make a deal with Watson in exchange for Watson testifying against Manson. And so I said I killed Sharon Tate. By that time, it hardly seemed important. I was numb after months and months of pressure from both the district attorneys and Manson's minions. While my two co-defendants at least had each other to confide in, I had no one. Though we stood together in the pictures for the newspaper, no one would even talk to me. They blamed me for getting everyone indicted. This was another reason I went with Manson's plan and confessed to killing Sharon Tate. Besides the constant threats and pressure from Manson, I realized I'd already been convicted. Whatever the outcome, either in life in prison or the death penalty, I was going to prison, and I was going to be locked up with these two women. My best hope was to mend that rift and try to get back in the fold. My testimony during the penalty phase of the trial was so ridiculous, the prosecutor claimed the holes in my story were a mile wide. In fact, he used my grand jury testimony as proof I was lying. Unfortunately for me, if you lie under oath, or if you tell two different stories under oath, the prosecution can use your inconsistencies to discredit parts of your story they don't want to accept, while parts of your story they want to use, they can call a confession. Though the prosecutor admits that almost everything I said during my penalty phase testimony was a lie, he can still claim I confessed under oath I killed Sharon Tate, and there's nothing I can do about it. Unfortunately, in our legal system, if you choose to commit suicide on the stand, there's nothing anyone can do to stop you. Chapter 27. The Difference Between Vampires and Angels. There are a lot of reasons to believe I did not kill Sharon Tate. I won't waste your time asking you to take my word for it. This book is absolutely worthless if the reader isn't skeptical. I'll simply lay down what other people have said, and you can weigh it as you see fit. I've already shown my exaggeration of my part in the crime when I was talking to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard in county jail, when I was in line with Manson's own admission that this is exactly what he told us to do if we ever were arrested. It is also in line with Graham and Howard's own assessments that I was simply exaggerating in order to look tough and hide the fact that I was scared. And I've shown that even the prosecutor admits my testimony on the witness stand during the penalty phase of the trial was almost complete nonsense directed by Manson with the sole purpose of shifting the responsibility for the crimes off Manson and onto myself and my co-defendants. And I've shown if my present claim that I didn't kill Sharon Tate is a lie, then it's one I made up over 30 years ago and have stuck to ever since. I can also point to the fact that I said I hadn't killed Sharon Tate during my grand jury testimony in 1969. This was the testimony I was told by the prosecutor had to be true or I could be executed. That's a strong incentive to tell the truth. Mr. Bugliosi, of course, believes I lied about that part of the crime in my grand jury testimony. I'm happy to point out that even Mr. Bugliosi admits my rendition of the crimes as told to the grand jury was corroborated in every instance by the version Linda Kasabian gave. And what makes this all the more impressive is that Linda never heard my grand jury testimony, nor could she in any way be induced to conform her story to mine. There was no reason to. She'd already been given complete immunity. Though Linda was not present in the Cielo house when Sharon Tate was killed, and therefore cannot confirm or deny that my part of the story, it carries a certain weight that in every instance where our stories can be compared, they corroborate one another. While none of this is proof in itself, it does indicate there is a real possibility what I say is true. But even beyond this, there are numerous objective indications my story is true. I've already mentioned Charles Watson has stated I didn't kill Sharon Tate. In addition, the prosecutor has admitted the knife I was carrying the night Sharon Tate was killed was actually found at the crime scene. It was tested for blood and it was found to be clean. It had never struck anyone. This evidence about the knife is strange for several reasons. The primary reason is because I didn't know about this until sometime around 1990, when I worked with several lawyers who, at their own expense and on their own time, actually went back and checked the prosecutor's account of the crime. I don't honestly remember anything about this at the trial. There is no dispute it was my knife, as Linda Kasabian was the one who handed out the knives and she identified it. But there is no dispute there was no blood on it. But I've been told the prosecutor has nonetheless insisted the fact my knife wasn't used doesn't prove I didn't kill Sharon Tate at all, claiming I could have borrowed Charles Watson's knife. The only problem with this explanation is if I'd had to ask Charles Watson for his knife, he would have discovered I'd lost my knife while we were still in the house. But Linda Kasabian testified Watson didn't discover this until after the crimes, when Linda was collecting the weapons, and I had to admit I'd lost my knife in the house. According to Linda Kasabian, Watson became very upset and yelled at me. We then discussed whether we should go back and look for it. In the end, none of us wanted to go back in the house. Whether you find this compelling or not, it is the prosecution itself that put forward the proof Watson didn't discover I'd lost my knife until after the crime. It's hard to insist Watson could have loaned me his knife without noticing my hands were already empty. Linda Kasabian, who was standing guard at the end of the front walkway, also testified that when the crimes began, she at first ran to the front door to find me and implore me to make the others stop. It was her testimony that I held out my hands and said I couldn't. Either way, whether you believe me or not is only an intellectual point. Conspiracy to commit a crime makes you morally and legally culpable whether you struck the actual blow or not. I was convicted for those deaths, and whether I physically partook of the crime or not doesn't matter legally. The reason it becomes interesting at all is because it has a very strong bearing on the difference between a vampire and an angel. During his final summation, right before the jury was sent out to determine whether to put me to death, the prosecutor told them I was a blood-drinking vampire. In contrast, he claimed that Linda Kasabian was an angel, a true flower child. I believe the truth is Mr. Bugliosi realizes there are a lot of reasons to believe I did not actually kill Sharon Tate, but I also believe it will be almost impossible for him to ever admit that. The reason is because if he admits I probably didn't kill Sharon Tate, he has to deal with the fact that I was nearly executed. This should bother him because if I didn't kill Sharon Tate, then there is absolutely no level upon which Linda Kasabian was less culpable than I was. Linda had been with the family for less than 2 months when she participated in the deaths of 7 human beings. Manson had over 2 years to threaten and pressure me. Linda had 2 parents, separated, and an ex-husband she could have escaped to, and eventually did. I had no one in the world to turn to. Linda claimed she participated because of fears for her 2-year-old daughter. I had a 2-month premature son to fear for. Linda had sharpened the knives at Spawn Ranch. I hadn't. Linda had carried a knife that night, just as I had. Linda had driven the car on both crime nights. I had not. Linda stood watch outside the Cielo Drive residence. I had not. Linda ran away from the crime scene at Cielo Drive. I had frozen and not had been able to participate. Linda collected the weapons and clothing after the Cielo Drive crime. I had not. Linda discarded the weapons and clothing after the Cielo Drive crime. I had not. After the Cielo Drive crime, when Manson asked all of us if we had any remorse, Linda claimed she did not, just as I had. Linda had gone out the next night fearing what would happen, just as I had. Linda had driven Manson to the LaBianca home. I hadn't. Linda stayed in the car at the LaBianca crime scene, just as I had. Linda accepted Miss LaBianca's stolen wallet from Manson. I hadn't. Linda had deposited Miss LaBianca's wallet at a gas station so the police would suspect a black person. I hadn't. Linda stopped the car so Manson could attempt to kill another motorist. I hadn't. Linda told Manson where another victim might be found the night of the LaBianca crime. I had not. Linda showed Manson where the other potential victim lived. I had not. Linda didn't go to the police even after she'd escaped from Spawn Ranch, while I agreed to help the police even when I was in jail and was being threatened for being a snitch. Linda didn't go to the police even after she got her daughter back. I agreed to testify even though I never got my son back. Linda didn't go to the police even when she and her daughter moved all the way to New York. Linda only offered to make a deal with the district attorney's office after she'd been indicted. I had agreed to work with the police as soon as I was implicated. Linda only agreed to testify against Manson on condition she be given absolute immunity for her part in the deaths of 7 people. I had agreed to testify against Manson and still go to trial for my part in the crime. Linda hadn't been the one to break the case to the police. I was. Linda hadn't been the one who got Charles Manson indicted. I was. Linda didn't go out with the police to try to find evidence. I did. Mr. Bugliosi claims Linda told him she still loved Manson even after watching him orchestrate the murder of 7 people even during the trial. I never claimed that. The only point upon which my heart in the crimes appears greater than Linda's is if one insists I killed Sharon Tate. Once that assertion is questioned, it becomes very hard to determine why I was the vampire and Linda was the angel. Other than the fact the prosecutor had to explain to the public why he was letting Linda go scot-free at the same time he was asking the jury to put me to death. It may be cynical, but it has to be pointed out that Mr. Bugliosi's book about the crime was published just before he ran for Attorney General of California. It wouldn't have looked good to have to admit Mr. Bugliosi had allowed Linda to walk away from 7 counts of first-degree murder simply because that was the deal he had to make. It was much better to insist she was given complete immunity because she wasn't culpable. She was an innocent angel. In fact, Mr. Bugliosi went so far as to claim he thought people would understandable how she could still love Charles Manson even after watching him orchestrate 7 murders. I can't. But Mr. Bugliosi also had to explain why, if I was so bad, the district attorney's office had agreed to make a deal with me. Mr. Bugliosi's account of the crime in trial is very detailed about his own insistence. He'd always been against giving me any consideration. Whether or not it was true, it was a very smart thing to say right before one runs for Attorney General. But all of this isn't an indictment of Linda. I know exactly the pressure she was under, and I know exactly what Linda was doing. She was doing whatever it took to stay alive and keep her daughter alive until she could figure out how to escape. She was putting an act so Manson, the man who killed his friend Gary Hinman when he insisted he didn't have any money and who'd had Donald Shea killed because he thought Shea had called the police on him, wouldn't suspect she was simply waiting for a moment to run. I know this. I know it even better than the prosecuting attorney. I know it because I was there. My son was being held by armed guards right along with Linda's daughter. I stood right beside her after the crimes as she told Manson she had no regrets out of fear, and I did the same. And I understand why she ran to New York and hid and didn't tell the police even after she retrieved her daughter from Manson's grasp. She was afraid. I understand this because I was afraid of him too. Linda did what she had to do to survive. And when the time came, she did what she should have, and she testified against Manson. I've never held that against her, even though by doing so, she testified against me as well. But I have been faced with quite a different situation. I could have either testified against Manson and then spent my life in prison trying to avoid getting killed by his minions and hoping they never found my son. Remember, my deal was simply that I wouldn't get the death penalty. I was still going to prison. Or I would have recanted my testimony and taken a chance he wouldn't be found guilty, and I would have known, no matter what the outcome of the trial, my son would be safe. Linda was faced with the choice of either testifying against Manson and walking away completely free, or refusing to testify and facing the death penalty. Linda made the right choice, and it's a choice I wish I'd had the opportunity to make, but I'd been faced with a much different situation than she was. Editor's note: in the subsequent wrongful death lawsuit filed after the criminal trial, Linda Kasabian was found equally responsible with the Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, and Susan for the deaths of the 5 people at Cielo Drive, including Sharon Tate, and Linda Kasabian was held joint and severally liable for millions of dollars in damages. Chapter 28. Life and Death Concurrently. In the end, we were all sentenced to death for the 7 murders that occurred at the Cielo Drive and LaBianca residences. Then we began the trial for Gary Hinman's death. By this time, I was exhausted emotionally and mentally by the trial and the continuing isolation my co-defendants were putting me through. As soon as the trial for Gary's death began, I agreed to plead guilty. I did it to get out of that courtroom and away from Manson. But when they asked me if I went to Gary's house as part of a robbery, I told them the truth. I didn't know Gary was going to be robbed. Then they asked me if I knew we were going to Gary's house intending to kill him, and I told them the truth again. I didn't know Gary was going to die. At this point, the judge delicately pointed out to me that in order to plead guilty, I had to actually confess to doing something wrong. Since I was being tried for first-degree murder, I had to admit to some form of premeditation, or he couldn't accept my guilty plea. So I told him I killed Gary by suffocating him with a pillow. It was an odd thing to say. It wasn't true. But I just honestly didn't see any reason for sitting in that courtroom next to Manson one more minute when I already had the death penalty. The district attorney got up and told the judge their evidence showed Gary had not been suffocated and they had never believed I'd killed him, but that they would accept my guilty plea because they believed I had known he was going to be robbed or killed and had gone there for that reason. The judge accepted my plea and sentenced me to life. I asked him whether I was supposed to serve that before or after my death penalty. I was told I would be serving them concurrently. As for Manson, he was tried and convicted for the murder of Gary Hinman and received an additional death sentence. Bruce Davis was also convicted for Gary's death, though as far as I remember, he merely showed up with Manson the afternoon Manson attacked Gary. He joined Bobby Bosale on death row. A later trial for the death of Donald Shea was conducted, but since I had nothing to do with that, I don't know the details. Manson was convicted again, as was Steve Grogan. The jury recommended the death penalty, but the judge gave Grogan life instead, claiming he had diminished capacity, I believe. Steve Grogan was paroled in 1985 after agreeing to lead authorities to the body of Donald Shea. To their surprise, contrary to Grogan's boasting in 1969, Donald Shea's body hadn't been cut into pieces. That was just a story to try to scare family members from talking to police. Charles Watson was later tried for the Cielo Drive and LaBianca crimes and was convicted as well. Though I don't know the details of that trial, I think because he was not under the threat of Manson, he was able to put forward a much more realistic defense, at least acknowledging the incredible pressure everyone in the family was under from Manson. Late in 1971, Manson ordered Catherine Scher and Mary Brunner to break another man out of jail. After the jailbreak, the three of them, along with other members of the family, instigated the robbery of a Hawthorne sporting goods store. Their goal was money and guns with which to break Charles Manson out of jail. They failed, and another long line of people headed to prison, misled by Charles Manson's talk of brotherly love and self-sacrifice, two concepts of which Charles Manson himself had no understanding of or use at all. Chapter 29. Life After Death. After my conviction, I was informed an appeal was being filed. It was being prepared by Charles Manson's attorneys. I wasn't informed as to what the issues were, and no one came and talked to me about it. But having seen how Manson's attorneys worked during the trial, I didn't hold out much hope. In 1976, the appeal was denied, with the exception of overturning Leslie Van Houten's conviction. It wasn't until the 1990s that one of my attorneys actually looked up the appeal and read the court's decision. The opinion is 108 pages long, and buried deep down on page 57 and 58 are three small paragraphs under the heading of Use of Perjured Testimony. Susan Atkins testified at the grand jury proceedings, but not at trial. Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham did not testify before the grand jury, but did testify at the trial. Manson draws attention to the fact that before the grand jury, Atkins stated that Watson had killed Sharon Tate. At trial, Graham and Howard testified that Atkins claimed she had killed Sharon Tate. From this conflict, Manson argues that he was convicted by the knowing use of perjured testimony. Manson makes much of Bugliosi's testimony during the penalty phase to the effect that he believed Atkins did stab Tate, even though he knew she would testify to the contrary before the grand jury. Bugliosi's opinion on the subject is just that. The record does not reflect that the testimony was in fact perjured. So there was. Almost a third of a century ago, the California courts determined my grand jury testimony was not perjured, explicitly concerning the death of Sharon Tate. I hadn't killed Sharon Tate, and the court had held there was nothing in the record to indicating I was lying when I said I hadn't, and no one had ever told me. In a related note, in 2009, I received a letter from Dr. Joel Hochman, who was the psychiatrist the prosecution used against me at my trial. He wrote, "I have never commented on your case, as I was not happy with the media circus that has always exploited it. I have been particularly unhappy with Mr. Bugliosi's distorted use of my professional testimony to argue against your release. I testified that anyone's children could have ended up in your situation as a part of a shared psychosis. He has repeatedly stated that I said just the opposite. It was a nice piece of validation, although completely unexpected. I hadn't thought of him in almost 40 years, and I was surprised he felt he had to write me. And the thing that seemed to upset him, what appeared to be his impotence for the writing, was the way this case was and continues to be twisted for the commercial market. Perhaps he always had second thoughts about this case, and after 35 years he felt he had to say something. Whatever the cause, it was a kind gesture." Shortly after the publication of his book, Vincent Bugliosi ran for Attorney General of California. If he had won, he would have been a step away from the governorship of California. And as Ronald Reagan had shown, that was a step away from a run at the White House. Bugliosi was beaten, ironically, by Ira Rayner, who had been Leslie Van Houten's defense attorney. Mr. Bugliosi had gone on to become a successful author of true crime novels. Stephen Kay, who was an assistant prosecutor at my trial and who represented the district's attorney office at most of my parole hearings, became a high-ranking administrator to the Los Angeles DA's office by the 1980s. I was told he always envied and resented the attention and money Vincent Bugliosi made off of the Manson case. Then an investigation uncovered that Mr. K had made a deal to free Stephen Jesse Cisneros, a diagnosed sexual predator known as the Riverbed Rapist, in exchange for having him testify that a suspect in another crime had confessed while in jail. According to the investigation, K admitted he felt there wasn't enough evidence to prove the other man guilty. So, in order to get the conviction, J arranged to have Cisneros released in exchange for his sworn testimony. Following his release, Cisneros kidnapped, assaulted, and/or raped 10 women. When Cisneros was finally apprehended, he admitted he'd lied in order to be released. No one had confessed to him. When the deal that led Cisneros' release finally came to light, Mr. K is reported to have dismissed the 10 women who had been raped and assaulted as just a small, teeny little offshoot. According to the report, K lost his high-ranking administrative position. I was told Stephen K was subsequently moved to the LADA's Compton department, far from the high-profile cases he was used to prosecuting in Los Angeles, which is why he missed prosecuting the O.J. Simpson case, and why he also missed the multi-million-dollar book deal Marcia Clark received even after losing the case. Following my conviction, civil wrongful death lawsuits were filed against me and my co-defendants, as well as Linda Kasabian. The jury determined all of us, including Linda Kasabian, were equally responsible for the deaths of Stephen Parent, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Sharon Tate. While I was on death row, my son was legally taken from me because no one in my family was willing to raise him. His name and identity have been changed and sealed, so I have no idea where he is or how he is doing. I have since been told his name was changed to Paul, and whether or not that is true, I like it. In the 1970s, I watched a talk show which featured a woman who handled difficult adoption cases and claimed to have handled the adoption of one of the Manson family children. Since my son was the only child who was taken away, it would have had to been him. My continuing separation from my son, even after all these years, remains the most poignant and enduring loss. Obviously, I wasn't executed. Due to the convictions of a bare majority of the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, the death penalty in America as it was imposed up until 1972 was determined to be unconstitutionally arbitrary. The California Supreme Court invalidated the death penalty in California even before the U.S. Supreme Court could, determining it violated the California Constitutional's prohibition against unusual punishments. My sentence was commuted to the harshest constitutional sentence California had at the time, 7 years to life with the possibility of parole. Of the several women on death row in California at the time, the Supreme Court invalidated the death penalty. Only me and my 2 co-defendants are still in prison. One of the other women was paroled after about 8 years. The others were paroled in the early 80s after serving about 13 years. None of these women ever came back to prison. In 1974, I made the best decision of my life when I accepted Jesus as my Savior and Lord. Since that day, my life has got better each and every year. I have been blessed over and over again. Charles Manson ceased being a part of my life in 1972, and this case stopped being a part of my life in 1974. While I still take responsibility for my part, I no longer allow it to dictate what I'm going to do in the future. No matter what mistakes you may have made in the past, they do not give you any excuses for failing to move forward with your life and to make the most of it and to be the best possible influence on those around you. As for my co-defendants, I've never interacted with them much. A lot of that probably was residual resentment for my getting them indicted. It probably also has to do with their disinterest, as well as my own, in being associated with the past. I know they both have exemplary post-conviction records, and both are regularly denied parole for little or no reason other than the crime. Leslie Van Houten, after having her conviction overturned by the appellate court in 1976, was retried a second time. The state dropped the charges against her in regard to the Cielo Drive crimes and only tried to convict her for the LaBianca crimes. The jury didn't convict her, so they tried her a third time. During the third trial, the court allowed her bail, and she spent 9 months out of prison, living in Southern California and driving back and forth to work every day, and no one even noticed. At her third trial, instead of trying her for the murder, the state tried her for felony murder, which means they claimed she merely intended to rob Miss LaBianca and had no idea anyone was going to be harmed. Because that's a felony in itself, if convicted, she would be held culpable for the murders even though she didn't know they were going to happen and didn't participate. She was convicted of felony murder and was sent back to prison in 1978. About 25 years after my conviction, I was in a child development education class, and my co-defendant Leslie Van Houten happened to be in the class as well. I'd been interacting in class and talking about how I'd been kept away from my son during his early development and how much I resented that. During the break, Leslie came up to me and apologized. She told me for over 20 years she disliked me because way back when we were all living at Spawn Ranch, Manson had told her my son was being kept with the other children because I didn't want him. Since Leslie and I didn't interact back then, she had no way of knowing it wasn't true. Just another indication of the subtle ways in which Manson was able to instigate resentment and ill feelings between people simply in order to make them easier to control. In the end, as decades and decades go by, I've been able to see the work both of my co-defendants have done in this institution, contributing to various community services and victim services. And so now, even though I still do not interact with them, I can appreciate how much they've made of their lives in this constricting environment. In the 1990s, Patricia Krenwinkel gave the only interview I believe she's ever given. I was surprised to hear the one thing she felt she needed to stress over and over again was that there was nothing cool about what happened during our crime. Apparently she, like me, has received abundant letters from people interested with the crime and convinced it was something other than a horrible, senseless tragedy. My hope for this book has been from the start that it will lay the crimes out in a way that makes them look like what they really were. There is nothing mystic about them, nothing impressive, nothing worthy of admiration. It is also my hope something good will come out of this. Every year, I receive dozens of letters from people asking me for advice and reaching their sons or daughters or their younger relatives concerning either drugs or the pitfalls of cults and gang mentality. Sometimes I get letters from police officers or correctional officers working with youth asking how to reach children and young adults when they get to the point where they're so alienated they no longer listen or trust anyone. And that's a tough question. One of the most important things to take from this whole story is that actions lead to consequences. Freedom involves responsibilities. Freedom is a gift and a treasure. That's what I'd like to think young people will take from this story. This is the past I have to live with, and I have to live with it every day. Unlike the reader or the people who seem to think Charles Manson was cool, I can't think about it for an hour or so and then go on with my life. This is with me every day. I have to wake up every day with this, and no matter what I do for the rest of my life, and no matter how much I give back to the community, I will never be able to replace what my crime took away. And that's not neat, and that's not cool. And I want to apologize once again to the families of the victims. I want to apologize for what my actions and my lack of courage took from them, for the loss they've suffered and which they continue to suffer.